I'm going to start and welcome everyone and say that my name is Andrea Allen. I'm currently the president of the Alumni Association, and we're very happy to have you here this evening. Our topic is the truth about reconciliation, healing the layers of oppression. So I will acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this location is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island and is still the home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work, live on this land. We all have responsibilities to be active players in the decolonization of which we are currently enacting by learning, showing up, speaking up, about the needs and desires of our Indigenous comrades. I acknowledge people like myself who were brought across the Atlantic without being given a choice. People who were brought on the transatlantic human trade ships. We must also acknowledge other nations who came to this land by choice through colonization. Some forgot that they are settlers. We give thanks to the Indigenous to the Indigenous ancestors for their patience, but acknowledge that it has been exploited. We've begun to share a little of where we are situated this evening, but if we could take a few moments and reflect on where we are and the Indigenous people whose land we're on, and who have been misplaced. This land acknowledgement is not performative, and it reflects my commitment and readiness to stand beside our Indigenous comrades towards their reclamation. So I'd like to welcome everyone this evening, and I'd like to introduce our speaker. Suzy Goodleaf's talk will address the idea of reconciliation for the Indigenous people of this land and why healing generational trauma can be a struggle. Suzy Goodleaf will look at the science of trauma, protective reactions to unresolved grief, and how awareness of oppression and the desire to connect to the key, is the key. Let me slow down. The desire to connect is the key to healing the rupture in the relationship between Native and non-Native people on this land. Suzy Goodleaf is a Mohawk Two Spirted person from Kahnawake. A member of the Bear Clan, Goodleaf has been formally trained as a psychologist and marital family therapist, specializing in the treatment of trauma resulting from multi-generational impacts of the oppression of First Nations people across Turtle Island. She has been fortunate to learn from elders and knowledge keepers from Kahnawake Nation and from other First Nations across Turtle Island for over 36 years while working in the field of wellness. Goodleaf is currently working in many areas, including at a private practice in Kahnawake as a psychologist at the Step by Step Family Center, as an instructor at the University of Toronto's Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency field of study, and as a general consultant for Goodleaf Consulting and Middelton-Moz Consulting. Her research interest includes Indigenous wellness and resiliency, especially in relations to COVID-19 coping strategies. Goodleaf was one of the original governing council members who fostered the promotion of the Indigenous Trauma Resiliency Program developed by Jane Middelton-Moz. Goodleaf continues to be a member of the Governing Council and Advisory Council with the university and ensures the integrity of the Indigenous values are upheld within the program. I'd like to turn the microphone over to Suzy Goodleaf at this time.
Thank you so much. My name is Kahnawake, Suzy Goodleaf, and my name is Ganyageha name. I was named from my great-grandmother, and that name means carrying the word forward. And so when I was talking with some of the elders, what they said that meant was that I have a way of bridging the two worlds together, and that's kind of been my role, is to try to make sense of our traditional ways as well as bringing forward the knowledge that we have through science and research and making sense of it all. So I guess in a sense, that's what I'm going to be trying to help to do tonight, and to look a little bit about some of the struggles that we've experienced as First Nations people, and then maybe how to be able to help that kind of moving forward. So we were just talking before that this picture that's in front of you is actually children who are wearing the orange shirts. So in the States, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but in Canada, we have a Reconciliation Day now that's been acknowledged, where people are wearing orange shirts to kind of signify that there's been an oppression that's happened, and that children were taken away to residential schools, and during that time their possessions were taken from them, and one of the young girls who was taken had an orange shirt, and so that orange shirt was taken and burned, as well as a lot of different traditional things that she would have had. And it was that orange color that was represented, because it was really difficult to get orange. And so it was a significant experience that happened, where when she shared her story during the Truth and Reconciliation hearings, that that story got known, and everybody started wearing orange shirts to signify the recognition of the story and all the stories that had happened during that time. So all the kids at Cattery School in Kahnawake wore their shirts, and they formed this heart, and it was only taken on Friday, this picture. And it was a really big movement that happened in my community. And one of the things I think that's really interesting is that as the world is starting to acknowledge that some atrocities happened in Canada, interesting enough, my own community is starting to acknowledge it. So one of the things that happens with trauma is that people go quiet and try to cope as best that they can. So I'm a second generation and third generation residential school survivor. So my dad went to residential school, and my grandmother went on my mom's side, and they never spoke a word about it. They never talked about anything that happened during that time. And it was only as I started realizing that I was carrying some real heaviness and, we go through these struggles. And I started asking questions that I recognized that there was a history here that I didn't even recognize myself. And so it was by getting to know this that I started asking more questions. And then it was in 2010, my dad actually passed away. And there was a resurgence of looking at what happened to people during residential school. And my dad wouldn't talk about it at the time. And so I was asked to be one of the clinical supervisors for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that went across Canada. And I thought, I'm not sure that that's such a safe or good idea, getting people together to tell these stories if there isn't appropriate support. And so there were residential school survivors who said, we really want to talk about this and our stories need to be heard. And so my job with Health Canada was to try to help so that the story sharing could be done in a safe way. And the first event that I went to was in Winnipeg. And in Winnipeg, there were 40,000 people gathered to hear the stories of residential school survivors. And of those people who were present, there were a good at least 10,000 who were actual residential school survivors. And they were telling their stories. And I'm not sure how much people know about PTSD, but when you put people together and you're telling really difficult stories, it ignites that within them, within everybody. And people were just walking around without kind of a safe place. So my job was to try to help so that we could share these stories in a good way and that it could be a healing experience for people. So over the years, that this Truth and Reconciliation Commission went across Canada, that was my job. And in doing that job, I heard really a lot of stories and really, really horrible stories that happened. Not only within the residential school, but within the communities before that, and then later on with day schools. So when we talk about how do we heal a reconciliation and how do we bring it together, it's really kind of a complex situation, because with people wearing orange shirts now, I was talking to um, Andrea about it a while ago, that it was kind of a bittersweet experience in the community because there's such sadness when we think about what happened. And we had a tobacco burning ceremony, and we had an acknowledgement of people and the stories that they had encountered, and also recognizing that a lot of the residential school survivors for my community have kind of passed. A lot of them are passing, or a lot of them are really elderly now. But we still hold all of the implications of that in our system. So we're trying to make sense of it as we move forward. So I just want to let's see if I can. Oh, maybe not. When we're talking about things, not everything is obvious. So you can look at this picture and you'll see one thing, and some other people will see something else. And what we see isn't always the same thing. And we might be looking at exactly the same thing, but not being able to see what's there. And so we want to be able to look at things coming from the same perspective. And what's really interesting is that when you look up reconciliation and what does it mean, is to mean restoration of friendly relations, or the action of making one view or belief compatible with another. But we're coming from like such different places. How can we come together and reconcile? So what was really interesting is, as I was kind of preparing for this, I was asking different people, what does reconciliation mean to you? And I was asking my family members about what they thought that would be. And people were like, how can we reconcile? What does that even mean? They were asking and they weren't quite sure of what that would mean for them. And they said, I don't think we can, because we're not at a place where people even acknowledge that what really happened to us. And we're still in a fighting position. So how can we reconcile? How can we come around and what do we have to reconcile when people don't acknowledge our belief system? So I wanna walk you through a little bit of kind of looking at what's happened. When I think about being a psychologist, it's kind of a native psychology perspective is always bringing in the spiritual. We look at ourselves as an interconnection between living things, and we experience the effects of each thing on ourselves. So I look at everything as being alive, and the trees and the water and the breezes, everything around us is part of who we are. So the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual are all working together as a whole, and that we can't separate ourselves, which is in many ways contrary to what psychology says or science says, right? That we have to look at pieces of ourselves. And from First Nations look that there's an understanding that we're all part of a bigger picture and that the spiritual will influence our psychological state. So we're always looking at it from a bigger perspective, which is often counter-indicated by a lot of the places that we are. And, you guys being interested in this topic are probably people who are already thinking in that way. And it's a hard way to think when you're in a society that's looking at how can we, get bigger and better things, and how can we do things faster when in fact how we are is really how we need to be. So when we look at First Nations kind of culture, traditionally everyone had a special role in teaching of the children. Traditionally, storytelling for First Nations was our verbal tradition, that we could tell stories about how things were, and that's how we learned. That children were shown how to and encouraged to try things. They were shown and then encouraged to give it a shot. Wasn't necessarily talked about how it would be done, but that you were shown and asked to try it. That we had feasting to celebrate life, that food was kind of a given in all of our activities and all of our ways of being, and that we acknowledged the land for being there for us, and that the gardens were there to ensure our subsistence. And that culture was a connection to land. And be it any of the First Nations from across Turtle Island, we all have our own way of connecting with the land. And that ceremony was the way of acknowledging who we were and where we came from. We always had a rites of passage that helped us through each part of who we were, acknowledging each. And that our values were always about kindness, respect, belonging, and inclusion. It was always a way of bringing people together and cooperation. And so this was the way that we functioned. And across different nations, we all have different words for this, but essentially this was the foundation of how we were as First Nations people. But then we say, well, what do we see in Winnipeg? What do we see in the cities of Toronto? And what do we see when we look at First Nations people? Is that everybody had a special place in the circle and family was the center. But when we look in the cities, what do we see? This is what we see. We see major depression, we see diabetes, we see addiction, we see suicide. We have the highest suicide rates in the country. We see non-compliance, people don't follow through with things. We see violence, we see helplessness, anxiety, heart disease, and addictions, FASD, and so forth and so on, right? So this is what we see on the outside, and this is our legacy in a sense, but we really need to look with what's underneath it all. And, the crux of it is really the colonization, residential school system, multi-generational trauma, and unresolved excessive grief. Because we know that when we don't heal and when we don't grieve, we end up replicating what's there. So the unthinkable in Canada is there are currently 3 times more Aboriginal children in the child welfare system today than the number of children in attendance at the height of the residential schools system in the 1940s. And that in Canada, 53.8% of children in the foster care system are Indigenous, although Indigenous population only counts for 7.7%. And this is 2021. So, it's so important to look at what is happening and what's the reality today, and why is it hard when people say, we want to reconcile, we want to bring things together, but our families are falling apart and our families are dying and our kids are committing suicide. How do we pull that together, right? And how can we come to a place where we can be in a good place? when I was working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were amazing resiliency that came forward. When one of the residential school survivors said, "What I don't understand," and this was so poignant for me, is that why I can't just tell my children that I love them and give them a hug. Why is it? And it wasn't this woman, but it was a man who just said, "I don't know why I can't even. I want to, and they're right there, but I can't do it." And that break in because of trauma and that break because of the losses has made it so difficult for connection to occur. And so my mentor, Middelton-Moz, talks about this in several of her books, but she says the trauma in this case is a continual erosion of self-esteem faced by ethnic and cultural minorities in a world where they are seen as lesser than others. The belief may develop early in these children's lives that their families lack power in the majority culture. So culture and ethnic self-hate leads to a sense deep in the core of self that there's nothing I can do to make up for the lacking in myself and the awareness that I am deeply and profoundly unlovable. It's such a strong piece, that regardless of how kind of much you develop and how much you work on yourself, this piece can always be hitting you, right? It always creates that sense of doubt and shame. And so, just in sharing with you that when we were doing this idea, I thought, okay, what am I gonna share tonight, or what am I gonna talk about, and how am I gonna put this together? And of course, I've taught this for a lot, and I've talked about it a lot. But then, as you know, I'm so glad that there are you people who have come. And then when there weren't more people, that got activated in me, and I had to take a breath and say, it's okay. There could have been more, but these are the people that need to be here. But that sense of shame is so deep inside each of us that we've worked on, I've worked on it so much, but it pops. It pops up, and I'm like, it's okay, but it's the work that we have to do. So there was this young girl that I was working with years ago, and she was an Inuit, and she was from far north, and she came down to see me, and she was working she just had a suicide attempt, and we were working on things together. And I asked her, can you put things, in writing? And she wrote this poem. I thought she was 13 at the time, and it just summarizes kind of the top of everything that we're looking at, is that she called it lost. And she said, lost the battle, lost the war, lost the things worth fighting for, lost the courage to win the fight, one more pill to kill the light. And after we worked together for a while, but it was really the connection that I had with her that helped her to kind of move past this and put this into something that was, I mean, it's quite a beautiful little poem, even though it's so agonizing in its expression. And how can we actually be with people so that we can get through this? I'm going to talk about a little bit later. It's Gabor Mate, who's done really interesting work, especially in his last book. I don't know if you've read it, but The Myth of Normal. I'm going to bring forward some of his ideas on that. And he talks about how can we really be with people in their distress in order to kind of get through. And so this is what we're looking at. How can we move through and be with people so that they can feel okay to feel what they need to feel? So traumas, there's personal trauma, what happens to you on a personal level, and many different traumas can occur, abuses or accidents or so forth. We have historical trauma, which is passed down. Multi-generational and vicarious trauma are traumas that didn't actually occur to you, but happened to your family. And we learned through the Holocaust that when it wasn't actually the Holocaust survivors who would come in for treatment, but it was their children and their grandchildren who would come in with those same symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety or depression. So it was really clear during those times that this is something that's passed on through the generations. And then, of course, intergenerational trauma is when the trauma isn't dealt with by that person, and so their behavior therefore becomes problematic, or say alcohol is a way of suppressing some of the feelings that you're having. And so alcoholism in the family system then gets passed down through the generations in that way. So whatever would go along with that. And so that we know that trauma is experienced as a life-threatening event, right? So a traumatic experience is something we experience as life-threatening. And the emotions that are stimulated are blocked from release. So that's what causes the traumatic reaction. And the human system splits the information. So this rock is kind of like our right brain and left brain, and creates a block so that we can't access or process the information. And it creates a disconnect within ourselves, so that the emotions are on one side of the brain and the ability to make sense of it is on the other side of the brain. And so that split makes it impossible to understand what is happening. I love this. I'm going to share this with you. And if you know Daniel Siegel's work, he's a great pediatric psychiatrist. And he works, of course, a lot with children, but he has this handy model. So he says, if you put your hand up in front of you and you put your thumb inside, that your thumb right here becomes the amygdala. And if you fold over your hand now, here's your brain. So you have your brain stem here, you have your frontal lobe over here, and inside is your limbic system and your amygdala. And so it's really simple, is that, so you see it's your brain. He says that when the amygdala senses danger, it reacts. And as soon as it reacts, it creates a flip reaction, and we have no more access to our frontal lobe. So we can't make sense of things. And the frontal lobe, of course, is linear language understanding. And the amygdala is our fight, flight, freeze reaction. So our whole body goes into a reactive state, it flips, and we can't make sense of what's happening at the moment. So this is a kind of a cute cartoon when we talk about the ventral vagal state, is when, when we're doing well and our whole brain is intact, this is where we are. There's a possibility of everything. And I can co-regulate, and I can self-regulate, and I can connect, and I can be with others, and I'm feeling really good, and I'm tuned on to the moment, and I'm resourceful, and I'm on top of the world. So I can do anything. I can learn, right? I can be flexible, and I can be resilient. When the amygdala flips, we go into a fight or flight reaction. And when that happens, the sympathetic nervous system takes over, and we're now in a state of danger, a fight, flight, panicked, anxious, alarmed, hypervigilant state, right? And so you're on the top of the ladder, but if somebody comes up, you're going to throw them off the ladder because you're in a fight state. You're in a state of just trying to save your life. And it's a story of an unsafe world and unsafe people around you. So the perception is that everybody is dangerous to you. Looking and listening for danger, and you're in a hypervigilant, and you're ready for protection. You're ready to save your life. And that's when this is happening. And when we go through that, there's like a curve that happens. And when we get to the other side of that, there's a dorsal state. And it's kind of the freeze reaction, or depending on what you know about the parasympathetic and the nervous system, we go into this state of despair. You see at the bottom here, he's saying the story of despair is when your whole system goes into recuperation. And when you're in recuperation, it's a foggy state, a numb state, disconnected and lost and abandoned, unreachable. We can call this a depressive state. Can be a dissociative state. It's when there's so much cortisol in the system that we shut down. So many people who've gone through these experiences of trauma over and over and over again have this experience of either the fight, flight, or freeze state. And we're in this place of kind of working between. This is where we want to be, and this is where we can learn. But in most cases, we're either in a hyperactive state or we're in a flat, numb state. So when we're talking about people who've been through so many experiences of trauma, oftentimes we're on the up or the downside. So I worked a lot up north with the Cree, and I was working very often with physicians. And I did this workshop with them because they kept asking me, why do people just not listen to what I say? And they have diabetes and they just need to take their medication. And I tell them what they should do and they don't follow through with it. They come in and they don't even talk to me. They don't ask questions. And I'm telling them how to eat and what foods to eat, and they ignore me. But they still come in. And I said, they said, why do you think they did that? And I said, well, one, you're a doctor. And two, they just go into a fight, flight, freeze state. And they're not going to do it because you're telling them to do it. If you want to go and have any impact, you have to join where they're at. So it was actually really helpful for them that I went into chemical stuff so that they could understand. It became something that, okay, they're going into fight, flight, freeze. So I have to help them to regulate before I can get them to take care of themselves. I'm like, yeah, that's it. Right. So how can we it's really important to understand. So even in our classrooms, right, if we're teaching or with our clients, if somebody goes into a reactive state, there's no point talking. We have to help them to get back into a grounded state again, and then we can move forward with any learning, any teaching, any movement together. So when people work for the government in particular, it's really important to recognize that there's a state of imbalance that happens. So oftentimes, and Roz, you see this, I'm sure, when you're working with the students and they have to write a paper, and now they have to write a paper, so their brain doesn't work anymore. Oh no, I have to write a paper, right? So they go into this fight, flight reaction and they can't think right. And that's why your connection with them is so important, because it's through the connection that helps the grounding, and then they can produce what is there. It is there, but it doesn't always look like that. And so what often gets misperceived is that, depending on what nationality you're coming from, but for us, it's you're a stupid Indian. And that comes right forward as soon as somebody goes into a bit of a fight reaction. It's those negative beliefs start to foster and start to come through. I don't know anything. It's true. I don't know why I'm here. There's an imposter syndrome in the ITR program. So it's the Master of Social Work program in Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency is where I'm teaching right now. And although these people are brilliant, right? And they're coming with such open and giant hearts, and they've done so much work in their community. As soon as there's something that is dysregulated for them a little bit, they go right into, oh, I shouldn't be here. I don't know what I was thinking. Of course, I can't do a master's program. What was I? And so this whole negative belief system starts fostering up. And it's like, okay, let's take a breath. Let's everybody breathe. Let's relax. Of course, you can do it. So when trauma is kind of entrenched in your body and your system, that defensive reaction comes out so fast and so clearly that it's such an important piece to kind of understand when we're looking at what's happening for people. So it seemed to be very helpful for the physicians to understand that piece, and hopefully that's helpful for you guys as well. And so when I say, creating awareness is the first part of doing trauma work. And when we're working with Indigenous population, that's what we're doing, is we're doing trauma work. Because sometimes we don't know what we don't know. So when I'm looking at a traumatic wound, I think of it as a deep-seated feeling of shame, a deep-seated shame-based feeling of being unworthy and never feeling good enough. And that's what gets kind of connected each time when we're looking at what's happened to First Nations people. So there's been a process, and some of you may or may not know the process, but it's a process of colonization that's happened around the world. And Niyama Akbar has written a lot about this, and he talks about, a way to create oppression in any a way to to take away, a way to oppress people or take away their power are based on these principles. And he says one of the most immediate ways to bring death to a body is to remove its head. And the slave owners realized that their power and control over the slaves was dependent upon the absence of any indigenous leadership. So how can we, so oppression or colonization was really about getting rid of leadership. It was about creating a belief of personal inferiority, creating community division, which we call lateral violence. And it was splitting the family, taking away children, and creating a sense of fear and dependence, so learned helplessness. And this were tactics that were used, that the government used in Canada and around the world. I'm just looking for my cursor here. So the effects of traumatic stressors on wellness, right? Historical and contemporary traumatic events can lead to a soul wound. And the soul wound is a spirit wounding, and it's cumulative over generations. So something that happened to my grandmother passed down to my father, passed down to me. And I'm hopefully not passing it too much down to my children, but we need to become aware of what it is. And the psychological ramification includes internalization of the oppressor. So we start to believe that we're not good, and that the unresolved grief and mourning bring up suicidality. And that was Braveheart who did some work on that. The thing is that when we look at complex trauma and multi-generational trauma, that the diagnostic category of PTSD doesn't really capture what's really happening inside. So it's very important to acknowledge the dynamic of it. So the Canadian legislation was developed by Duncan Campbell Scott, and there were many acts. There were Indian Act, right, over many years. And his objective was, until they don't know themselves, until they hold their own relations down, until they can't remember, until they fear responsibility, until they won't lead, until they loathe their own, until there's not a single Indian that hasn't been absorbed into body politics of Canada, and there's no Indian question. That was what the legislation was about in Canada. So there was the British North America Act, or Gradual Re-enfranchisement Act, the Indian Act, and then the Indian Advancement Act. And I'm just going to give you this little piece. When I do this if this was live, we'd actually be walking through this, but it'll help you to look at it in a certain way. So within First Nations culture, it's the drum is the heartbeat of our nation, is in the center, and all of the medicines that we have there are what is our core, our ceremonies, our language, and our way of connecting with the world. So if you just imagine, that was really at the center of who we were. And then closest to that were the children. The children were always at the center of everything that we did. And then the women were next. And the women had the responsibility, of course, of bearing children, but taking care of the children. And then they always had the support of the grandmothers. They always had that. So there were the culture in the center, then the children, then the women, and then the grandmothers. And then right alongside them next were the two-spirited people who had the role of being the in-between between the women and the men, and who often played the role of guidance and filled in wherever there was something missing. And then there were the men and the warriors who would guard and take care of all that was there. And they'd often leave and hunt, but they'd come back and take care of things. And this was the setup. So, and it worked really well for a long time. There was always, if you're in the center, you know where you're going to be going to, and then you were always watched really closely. And the way this is set up is that everybody felt protected and safe, and everybody knew what their role was. So mostly this worked really well. And, up until when the settlers came in, this is the system that they saw. And what they saw was really strange to them because, praying to the trees and rocks was a little bit out there and they didn't quite know what was happening. And the children in the center, of course, was not something that was acceptable because in Europe, children were seen and not heard. They were definitely not in a place of focus. And then women who were actually telling the men what to do, that was also really unheard of. That's not something that would happen in Europe. And the two-spirited people, again, were not accepted. And so the whole structure that they saw when they came was not part of their way of thinking. And so for a long time, they needed our help, and we worked well together, and we made an agreement. And in Kahnawake territory, what is called is the Turo Wampum, so that we'll be in our canoe and we'll do our way, and you'll be in your canoe and you'll do your way, and we can live in harmony this way. We're each going to have our own ways of being, and it will be that way. So we made treaties to that effect, and we worked together for really a long time. And it was really during the British North America Act, when Canada became a country onto its own, that all of that changed. And that the idea of Canada needing more, and that the treaties that were signed with the Crown, so then they became null and void. So we don't have to follow those treaties anymore, and we don't need to have you to follow anything. And what they wanted to do now is to, build Canada. So Canada is going to get bigger and better. And now these Indians are in the way. So what can we do about that? So they divided or came up with the Enfranchisement Act. And the Enfranchisement Act said that, people who were smart enough to get a degree didn't have to be Indian anymore. People who could marry a non-native didn't have to be Indian anymore. And if you were brave enough to be part of Her Royal Majesty's Army, you didn't have to be Indian anymore. And so we lost some people to these things. And then they said, well, we have to get them to be absorbed into the body politic of Canada. So we'll offer them money. We'll get them to leave the reserve, and we'll get them to leave these places by offering them money and land. And that worked a little bit, and it created some division in the community, but essentially it brought people closer together. And so what Canada did was they said, well, that's not working. That first plan isn't working. So we have to do something else. So they developed the Indian Act. And the Indian Act said, well, we got to keep track of them. So we'll give them all a number. We'll make sure that they're on a reservation, and we'll make sure the land is divided so that they can't leave the reservation unless they check in with the Indian agent. And in order to leave any of our reserves, we had to check in with the Indian agent. And they said, there needs to be a ban on all of these ceremonies. We have to get rid of this Indian culture. And they took it away. So if you were to practice your language, your culture, your ceremonies, you would be imprisoned. And what happened with that is that the communities got really concerned. People went underground to practice ceremony, and the community got closer together, and now it became an us and them. When that happened, they said, we got to up this situation. And that's when the children were taken. So the center of all of the way that we were became devastating. And the amount of grief that was experienced in all of our communities was overwhelming. And grief without a way of processing it through ceremony and ritual became a devastation. So we have all of this unresolved grief that we weren't able to process. And what we see now in our communities is missing and murdered women. And we see the two-spirited people left in our communities as well. So we see those holes, and we see what the impact has been in assimilation and in integration that Canada has tried to do. And so we see that, children in residential school died 1 in 25, and Canadians serving during World War II were 1 in 26. So we know that, when those 224 children's bodies were found in the places in 2021, just a couple of years ago, that surge of grief just exaggerated again. At the same time that reconciliation, ideas of reconciliation were coming together. So you could see how the idea of reconciliation is there, but the pain of the amount of grief that's there is surging high. So Canada said, in order for anybody to get funding, you have to be in this kind of system. And we went from a circular system into a pyramid system and a hierarchical system, which is Canada and most of the world functions in this way. And so we needed a chief and council, social workers and police to take care of all these problems, a school system, and the parents and the elders were left at the bottom, kind of as tokens. And what happened with that was that we were left with shame. I'm no good for who I am. My culture is no good. And so the kids coming back into this frame were like, what is this? And how can I integrate back into my family? So there was a sense of learned helplessness, is like, no matter what I do, I don't have a place. And when trauma occurs, we have issues of don't trust, don't feel, and don't talk. And then lateral violence occurs, where in our own communities, we have our people fighting each other. And it happens in any community that has been oppressed. So think about it for yourself. The women's community, we're really good at beating each other up. The gay community, we're really good at beating each other up. I'm sure in the Black community, pretty good at beating each other up, right? So when you don't feel good for who you are, when you've been pushed down, the only way to get any power is laterally. So that we start fighting each other in our own communities in order to feel like we have a sense of power at all. And so we see this concept of lateral violence, where if you have a job, or you think you're so good, or you're on welfare, you're just a bum. Like, we call each other out instead of trying to raise each other up in order to get a sense of being okay. If you're a Mohawk speaker or if you're a French speaker, there's fighting that happens, Catholic, Protestant. In each of the communities, it would be similar in terms of what oppressive group you've been part of. When Jane did some work, she looked at grief work around the world. So, when we talk about colonization, it's not only in Canada, it's most recent in Canada. But when a trauma occurs, there's disconnection. When there's disconnection, then there's alcohol and drug use. When there's drug and alcohol use, then there's drug and alcohol related deaths. And when that happens, then there's domestic violence and sexual abuse that happens. When that happens, then there's community violence, there's suicide, school dropouts, homicide, then there's gangs and school shootings. And now what we're seeing in the world is mass shootings. So it's not only within First Nations communities, it's when grief isn't worked through. This is what happens, and this is what we see. So in order to heal from trauma, you have to feel safe. You have to be in a receptive state. You must be grounded in the present, and you must be open to being with someone to help guide you through. So, how safe can we feel? How safe can we be when there's been all these levels of oppression? Right? So, like, how can we work through this? What can we do about this? So when we look at what is safety, it's an environment which is safe for people where there's no assault, challenge, or denial of their identity, who they are and what they need. It's about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge, and experience of learning together with dignity and truly listening. And this was a study that was done for nursing. working in First Nations communities. And can we get to that place where we can feel safe together? How can we do that? How can we together create an atmosphere of safety? How can we reconcile? How can we bring this forward? And it's really through the relationship where I think this might be able to happen. So I mentioned a while ago that, I was reading the Gabor Mate's book, and I think he brought out some really important pieces. And what's really funny is that he often will state in his book that Indigenous, that science is finally connecting with Indigenous knowledge, because we've kind of already always known these things, but now we're putting it together. So he talks about the 4 A's and the 5 compassions of healing. So if we can be truly authentic, truly be who we are, if we have a state or sense of agency so we can move that, if we can express anger as anger, not as a reaction, and if we can truly have acceptance. So for any of us, this would be a way in. And what he says is that when we're in a state of oppression, these are the other pieces that are very important, is to have people who can help to walk with us. So to have activism in a sense of agency and to have advocacy. So I think that, a big part of just you even listening to what I have to say tonight is about having a sense of advocacy already, just even listening. And to me, having a sense of authenticity. And the concept of compassion, he talks about having ordinary human compassion where you can just feel for another without judgment. And he talked about how important that is. And our elders talk about this as well, is that can we truly be with people in their suffering? Can we? Of course, many of us don't want to because it hurts if you're truly with somebody. And to listen even to what I shared with you tonight, like that's hard. It's hard to hear what I have to say. It's hard to hear the atrocities that have happened. But compassion is about being able to feel that and hear that. Compassion of curiosity, so being curious about, maybe you showed up because you're curious and you want to know. Compassion of recognition, recognizing what has happened. Compassion of the truth. So we say truth and reconciliation. What's the truth? What is the reality? And when we looked at that second slide, our truths are different. But can we be in a place where we can look at that and truly look for the similarities in what the truth is instead of the differences? And compassion of possibilities. So I think, that's a piece of what I wanted to share with you tonight, and maybe we could just talk about that a little bit. And I'll leave you with this slide, which I think is just really cool because I like crabs, and so I have this next one. How can we get out of the bucket, right? And I think a lot of times it's like First Nations people, we have to do it ourselves, but we need assistance in order to do that, and people who can believe that it's possible to do it. If you try to do it for us, it's not helpful, but alongside us, truly helpful. So what do you think?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suzy. That was really excellent and deep. If we take the moment to reflect, I really appreciate what you shared. When you started off talking about um, carrying the word forward as the definition of your name, is that correct?
Mhm. Yeah.
carry the word forward. I thought that was indeed so important.
Mm,
And what will stay with me as well is that, yes, people go quiet.
mm,
People go quiet. Yeah. And we're losing that generation. And just as with young children, pre-language, we don't know all of what happened. It's so important to capture before we lose more.
mm.
Yes. So I thank you very much for your talk. I hope others appreciated it as well.